Hello, welcome back. It's me, Xpsupernova, and today we're going to be finishing the B Weapons Only challenge. Now, if you weren't here for the previous video, B Weapons Only counts as any weapon that starts with the letter B, and that's pretty much simply it. So without further ado, let's get straight into the challenge now, shall we? Now, our first priority was actually to go after some Cursed Flames, since Cursed Flames could be used with the Blowpipe, which turns out is actually not that terrible of a weapon in hard mode. However, underground in close quarters, it's really not all that good, so we would need to get ourselves a better weapon for farming enemies. Luckily, we had a weapon that was actually not all that terrible to get, thankfully enough, in the Blade Tongue. The Blade Tongue does take a while to fish up, but overall it doesn't take too long, and I eventually fished it up in a world you'll be seeing in a different challenge going up ahead. Now the Blade Tongue, for those of you who don't know, is a weapon that actually shoots an ichor spit every time you hit an enemy with it. And surprisingly enough, if you use a flask with it, you can actually have it shoot a stream of Cursed Flame as well, which is actually kind of interesting, not gonna lie. Now our next priority after farming Cursed Flames with the Blade Tongue was actually to go get ourselves some wings, and it just so happens that tier 2 wings are just ever so slightly better than our bundle of balloons. So much for fishing up the sandstorm in a bottle in the previous episode. Oh well. However, me being forgetful as I am, I end up just completely forgetting to make tier 2 wings after getting a solo flight, and instead decide to go fight Queen Slime for the Blade Staff, another B weapon that we'd be able to use during this challenge. Now, Queen Slime, being the first boss in hard mode, isn't all that terribly difficult in spite of her spamming projectiles everywhere, because our mobility was still good even without wings in the first place. On top of that, I also didn't really use any particular set of armor from hard mode and was still using shadow armor from pre-hard mode. And also, on top of that, I didn't even make an arena. This just kinda goes to show that Queen Slime is still pretty much a joke, even with my setup I have right now. So yeah, we even got the Blade Staff first try, thankfully, so I didn't have to refight Queen Slime at all, which is kind of nice. Now, after defeating Queen Slime, I decided the best idea for me to prepare for future bosses was actually to go get myself some spider armor, as spider armor pairs pretty well with the Blade Staff, as the Blade Staff usually needs more summons to perform pretty well. Unfortunately, we aren't able to get any whips in this challenge, as no whip starts with the letter B, unfortunately enough, and the Blade Staff really relies on having tag damage from whips to do furious damage. Anyways, after making the spider armor, I finally remembered to make myself some wings, so I quickly went to the hollow and farmed for some pixie dust until I had enough dust to make myself some pixie wings. Before fighting the mechs, I decided it would be a good idea to actually go fight the Old One's army a couple of times, so that way we would have enough defender medals to actually get ourselves a tier 2 sentry, since we were going to be farming the Old One's army quite a bit for a weapon we'd be getting later on. But for now, the ballista rod would be pretty useful for us. The first mech I decided to fight was actually the Destroyer, since I figured the Blade Tongue would actually do some pretty solid damage alongside the Blade Staff. But as I mentioned earlier, the Blade Staff really wasn't doing all that much here, because, again, it really isn't getting any tag damage bonuses from a whip or anything. And I did end up eventually dying, but I survived a surprisingly long time considering that I was being bonked around by lasers the entire fight. I also ended up trying the twins afterward, and I did slightly better against the twins, but overall we really weren't doing all that well, unfortunately enough. It just so happens that B weapons aren't all that good in early hard mode. Also, on a side note relating to the Odin's army, it turns out that for tier 1 at least, it's actually a really solid moneymaker, as Dark Mages end up dropping a ton of money with their banners and everything else. So if you're ever struggling on money pre-mech, you can actually just end up killing the Old One's army a ton of times with just a powerful pre-mech weapon in hard mode, and you'll get tons and tons of money. After fighting the Old One's army a couple more times to pass the day, I decided to actually go fight Skeletron Prime once night came, and thankfully enough, I actually did win this fight. It was quite a bit more challenging than Queen Slime, since Skeletron Prime has a lot of HP, and I actually cut the timer pretty close, all things considered. The Blowpipe and the Blade Tongue were actually pretty useful weapons for dealing damage, and the Blade Staff also ended up doing some pretty okay DPS at least. Though again, it would still benefit more if we actually had a whip that we could use during this challenge. After defeating Skeletron Prime, I decided it would be a good idea to actually go fight the Old One's army again, since it actually got an upgrade into tier 2 now. Thankfully enough, the tier 2 doesn't actually pose as much of a threat as I thought it would, and the Ballista Staff actually did some pretty good damage, all things considered. But I did die a couple of times trying to get enough medals for a full set of Squire armor, which actually ended up making the difference and let us beat tier 2. I also ended up getting the Brand of the Inferno, which is pretty much completely irrelevant, so much so that I didn't even include it in the thumbnail. Anyways, after fighting the Old One's army, I decided to go fight the Destroyer once it became night once again. And it just so happens that the Blade Tongue and Squire Armor pair together very well and end up doing pretty serious damage to the Destroyer, and we kind of just ended up melting him. So yeah, the Destroyer was just pretty much a non-issue after getting ourselves some useful upgrades. The Twins were also a complete joke as well, as our Squire Armor just lets us face tank pretty much everything before Planta, thankfully enough. And the Blade Tongue also was able to get some neat hits in, but overall I probably should have just used the blow type during most of these fights since it has better range and actually would have done damage. I could have optimized a lot more for this challenge, but overall, that's not really needed in an expert mode playthrough for the most part. Now my next priority after defeating the mechs was quite simply just to build myself a Plantera arena, which took quite a while since it takes forever to mine through the jungle with all the chlorophyte blocking explosives everywhere, and also me not having enough money after reforging tons and tons of accessories and weapons. Turns out the Blade Tongue is a very expensive weapon to reforge, all things considered. Anyways, once my arena was fully fleshed out, I decided to go fight Plantera, and I lost, primarily because I was going mostly true melee with the Blade Tongue for the most part. I really should have used the blowpipe during these fights, but I was still too lazy to do that, and I kinda wanted to go true melee because I thought it was funny. But anyways, after I got to the second attempt with Plantera, or third, I don't remember exactly which one, I ended up finally defeating Plantera. She overall was kind of a difficult fight since I was still going mostly true melee. But overall, the fight wasn't all that terrible, all things considered. Now, my next idea after fighting Plantera was actually to go fight the Pumpkin Moon, so I went to the dungeon to go farm for some ectoplasm, which was kind of painful since we were still using pre-mech weapons, unfortunately enough. And I ended up trying to go fight the Pumpkin Moon, and it went absolutely terribly, unfortunately. It just so happens that our DPS is nowhere near enough to actually kill a pumpkin to get ourselves a Bat Scepter. So I did the next best thing that I could do, and I decided to fight Duke Fishron with none other than a blowpipe. And due to me being unusually good at Duke Fishron, I think I fought this boss way too many times, since he is my favorite boss after all. I actually just ended up beating him first try, and on top of that, I also got the bubble gun first try, an absolutely phenomenal weapon that'll be carrying us for pretty much the rest of the run. Also for the reference, Duke Fishron took a whopping 12.5 minutes to actually fully defeat, so yeah, this fight was quite tedious, but overall I had an enjoyable time doing it still. Now, our next priority after Fishron was actually to go get ourselves some Spectre armor, so in order to do that, I needed to go to the jungle and mine a ton of chlorophyte, alongside going back to the dungeon, which was still painful even with the bubble gun to be honest, and get myself some ectoplasm, so that way I could fully make myself a set of damaging Spectre armor. Anyways, after getting ourselves a bit more geared up with armor and the such, I decided it would be a good idea to actually go fight Golem next. Now, normally I would just go through the jungle temple all fine and dandy as per usual, but this time I just decided to hoik through into the temple because I didn't really feel like dealing with all the traps in the temple this time around. And Golem, as you would expect, was completely melted by the bubblegum inspector armor. Like, he legitimately died so fast, and he didn't even hit us all that often. So yeah, overall, Golem was still a complete joke as always. Anyways, with the bubble gun in tow, we really didn't have all that many issues with Cultist either. He got melted really dang fast. We just fought Cultist like immediately after Golem with pretty much no downtime. Anyways, it was time for the most god-awful part of the game after defeating Moonlord. The Pillars. I just love them taking 2,000 hours to finally defeat, and sometimes just dying because I keep getting impatient from going in between the pillar loading zone. I just completely love that, man. And not only that, I love dying to Moonlord immediately afterwards, because I've never defeated Moonlord first try. Because, yeah. Now, I was actually planning to beat Moonlord on stream here, because I was actually streaming this challenge, believe it or not, and might be doing that for future challenges, but that's beside the point. But yeah, unfortunately I just was not able to, so instead I decided to actually go fight the Old One's army once again, for Tier 3. And Tier 3 was significantly harder than the previous two tiers, as we actually needed to get ourselves full Valhalla armor to actually even stand a chance to get it instant in the first place. And Betsy wasn't really all that much of a joke either. And after defeating Betsy for the first time, we actually ended up getting ourselves both Betsy's wings, which I didn't really use all that much, but were still kind of useful and neat to have. And, more importantly, Betsy's Wrath, a surprisingly useful weapon. It might not be the best weapon out there, but it's still surprisingly solid and has better range than our bubble gun, so it'd definitely be useful going ahead at least. And besides that, all we really needed to do was fight Lunatic Cultists and the Pillars again, and we'd finally be able to fight Moonlord one last time. Now, Moonlord was not exactly a super easy fight, but I wouldn't have called him super hard either during this attempt, since the Valhalla Knight breastplate and the Squire helmet actually give you such an insane regeneration boost that I was actually kind of face tanking Moonlord for the most part. It was honestly kind of insane, to be fair. Thankfully enough, however, I didn't actually die to him, though I did get very, very close to dying towards the end, where I got hit by a phantasmal death ray from one of the Eyes of Cthulhu. Thankfully, however, we did end up defeating Moonlord towards the end. And with that finally said, that's about it for the video. If you enjoyed, consider leaving a like or maybe even subscribing, as that helps out the channel a ton, or checking out the Discord server in the description below, which is free, by the way. And without further ado, I thank you all for watching and hope to see you all in the next one. Goodbye!